"Take me as your wife, or let me die." Apache widow begged. The rancher wouldn't let her die. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the dry, rugged land. The wind swept across the plains, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. The world seemed endless, but for the Apache widow, every step she took felt heavier than the one before. Her body ached from days without proper food, and her heart felt heavier still. She had lost almost everything that had once given her life meaning. Her husband had died months ago, leaving her alone in a world that offered little mercy to a woman without protection or family. She had traveled far, wandering across the rocky hills and empty valleys, surviving on the little she could find. Sometimes it was roots or berries, sometimes a rabbit she could catch. Each night she slept under the open sky, using the stars as her blanket and the cold earth as her bed. She had learned to endure pain and hunger, but loneliness was a weight no meal could lighten. She often thought of her husband, remembering the warmth of his hand, the gentle sound of his voice, the life they had shared. Those memories brought a bitter mix of comfort and sorrow, a reminder of everything that had been lost. The widow knew that she could not survive much longer on her own. Her strength was failing, and the cold nights were cooler than ever. She thought about the life she had once known, the small joys that had made her days bearable, and she wondered if she would ever feel that warmth again. She had tried to ask for help in towns and villages along her path, but the world was not kind to women alone, especially those who were not from the local communities. Doors had been closed, faces had turned away, and many had looked at her with suspicion or pity. She had learned not to rely on anyone, to trust only in her own will to keep moving forward. Still, even in the darkest hours, a spark of hope remained. She had heard of a ranch nearby owned by a man who was known for his quiet strength and fairness. Though she had never met him, she knew that reaching his home could be her last chance. It was a risky journey, but what did she have to lose? Life on the open plains was becoming unbearable, and death seemed closer with each passing day. She set her jaw, held her head high despite the fatigue, and began walking toward the distant outline of the ranch, a place that might offer safety, or at least one last chance to plead for mercy. Every step brought memories of the life she had lost. She remembered the laughter of her family during the harvest, the smell of fresh bread in the morning, the songs her husband used to sing softly by the fire. Those memories were both a comfort and a curse. They reminded her of the warmth she had known, but they also made the cold reality of her present situation feel sharper. Hunger gnawed at her belly, fatigue weighed down her limbs, and the fear of dying alone followed her like a shadow. Yet she did not allow herself to stop. She had a purpose now, simple but urgent: to survive, to find shelter, to live another day. As she approached the ranch, the landscape began to change. The rough hills gave way to a gentle valley, and in the distance the wooden structures of the ranch became visible. Smoke curled from a chimney, a sign that life existed here. And for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope in her heart. Maybe here she could find the help she so desperately needed. Maybe she could find a place to rest, a meal to fill her stomach, and perhaps even a chance to heal the emptiness inside her. Her heart raced as she walked closer. She had no plan, no words prepared, only a deep, desperate wish to be seen, to be heard, to be given a chance. She could imagine the rancher, a strong man accustomed to solitude and hard work, and wondered how he would react to a woman like her. Would he turn her away, as so many others had? Or would he offer kindness, even if he did not fully understand her suffering? The uncertainty made her stomach churn, but she pushed forward. There was no turning back now. Finally, she reached the edge of the ranch. The fences were tall and sturdy, the land well cared for, and the animals grazing peacefully. She paused for a moment, taking in the scene. For a woman who had known only struggle and loss for so long, it was almost overwhelming. The sight of life continuing, steady and strong, filled her with a mixture of awe and fear. She was a stranger here, a person with nothing to offer, and yet she had to try. She could not afford to let pride or hesitation stop her. With trembling hands and a heart full of hope, she approached the main house. The door opened before she could knock, and the rancher appeared. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to weigh every word before it was spoken. She looked at him, feeling the weight of her exhaustion and her desperation, and she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Take me as your wife, or let me die." The words hung in the air like a fragile thread, heavy with the fear and hope of a life that had almost ended. She did not know what she expected, perhaps acceptance, perhaps a final refusal. But she knew that this plea was her last chance. Her body trembled not just from the cold or the journey, but from the raw honesty of her words. She had no pretense, no hidden motives, only a desperate need to live and to belong somewhere. The rancher studied her carefully, his face unreadable. He could see the truth in her eyes, the exhaustion and grief, the courage that had carried her this far. He could see a life that had been nearly destroyed but was not yet fully gone. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he simply watched her, taking in her presence, her desperation, and her quiet strength. He did not dismiss her. He did not ridicule her. In that moment, he made a choice, not to decide her fate immediately, but to acknowledge her humanity. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You will not die here," he said. "Not tonight." He did not promise marriage. He did not promise a future. He promised life. And for the widow, that was enough to ignite a spark of hope that had been nearly extinguished. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, her body collapsing slightly with relief. For the first time in weeks, she felt that she could breathe without fear of the end pressing down upon her. That night, as she sat by the fire eating a warm meal for the first time in days, she realized that survival was not just about finding food or shelter. It was about being seen, being acknowledged, and being given a chance to continue, even when the world had seemed ready to let her fade away. She thought of her husband, of the life they had shared, and she allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps life was not finished with her yet. Perhaps, with time and care, she could find a place in this world again, a place to heal, a place to belong, a place to live. And so, under the quiet light of the fire and the watchful eyes of the rancher, the widow's journey took its first true step toward hope. She was still weary, still fragile, and still carrying the weight of her past, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the possibility of a future. The plains outside the ranch were vast and unforgiving, but within the walls of this home, she had found a moment of safety, a moment of peace, and the faint yet powerful promise of a life that had not yet ended. The morning light spilled gently across the ranch, brushing the wooden fences and the grazing animals with a soft gold. The widow had spent her first night inside the ranch, her body resting on a simple bed, her mind restless with both gratitude and unease. She had eaten a warm meal and felt her strength slowly returning, but she knew the day ahead would not be easy. The rancher had promised she would not die here, but he had not promised anything else. The uncertainty hung over her like a cloud she could not shake. She moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb the rancher as he began his daily chores. She watched him work, the way he handled each task with steady hands and quiet precision. There was a rhythm to his movements, a calm certainty that came from years of experience. He fed the animals, repaired a fence, and tended to the small garden, all without a word to her. The widow felt a mixture of admiration and nervousness. She had never met a man like this, strong, capable, and yet so quietly reserved. She wondered if he would ever look at her and see more than a weary stranger in need of help. When he finally spoke, it was not with anger or impatience, but with a steady, measured tone. "You will not die here," he said again, repeating the promise from the night before. "But you will not be my wife, not because of a plea or fear." His words were calm, but they carried weight. The widow felt a mix of relief and disappointment. She had expected refusal, yes, but she had also hoped for the chance to stay, to belong. The rancher's refusal was not cruel, but it was firm, and it forced her to confront the reality that her life could not be saved simply by words. Still, she accepted his offer of shelter and work, knowing that survival meant more than pride. She helped him with the chores, learning quickly how to care for the animals, gather firewood, and mend fences. Her hands were calloused from the hard journey, but she worked with a quiet determination. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the way the animals responded to care, and the satisfaction of seeing a day's work completed. With each passing hour, she felt herself regaining not only strength, but a sense of purpose. The rancher observed her carefully, noting her resilience and quiet courage. He could see the fear in her eyes, the deep sorrow, and yet he also saw a strength that had carried her through unimaginable hardships. He had met many people in his life, but few had moved him as she did. She was not simply a woman in need. She was a person who had endured loss and pain, who had walked a path that most would have abandoned long ago. He respected that, though he did not yet trust it fully. Over time, their days settled into a routine. The widow woke early, helping with chores before breakfast. She fed the animals, cleaned the stalls, and helped with small repairs around the house. She began to enjoy the work, feeling a sense of accomplishment she had not known for months. The rancher, in turn, began to share small moments of his life with her. He spoke of the challenges of ranch life, of the long hours and endless labor. He did not speak of personal matters, but even these glimpses allowed her to understand him better. They began to build a quiet connection, one not built on words or promises, but on shared work and mutual respect. Despite the growing trust, the widow could not forget the fear that had brought her to the ranch in the first place. She had come with a plea, a desperate hope that life would be given to her on his terms. But the rancher's refusal had shown her that life was not something to be begged for. It was something to be earned, something to be lived through action and courage. She realized that her journey was not over, and that survival meant more than mere existence. It meant finding a place in the world, a reason to continue, and a way to heal the wounds of her past. The rancher, too, began to see the widow in a new light. Her silence was not weakness, but reflection. Her careful movements were not fear, but respect for life. He began to notice small acts of kindness, the way she cared for the animals, the thoughtfulness she showed in preparing meals, and the quiet determination that guided her every action. He could see that she was not a woman who could be defined by a single moment of desperation. She was much more than that. She was a survivor, and he could not help but feel a growing admiration for her resilience. One afternoon, as the sun hung high in the sky, the widow worked in the garden pulling weeds and tending to the plants. The rancher joined her, not with instructions or orders, but with quiet presence. He worked alongside her, and for a moment, words were unnecessary. The rhythm of their labor, the shared effort, and the silence spoke volumes. They were two people, each carrying burdens of the past, finding a fragile balance in the present. The widow felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in weeks, she did not feel completely alone. She felt seen, not just as a person in need, but as someone capable of contributing, of making a difference, however small. Evenings on the ranch were quiet. They shared simple meals, often sitting in silence, listening to the wind sweep across the plains and the distant calls of animals returning to their shelters. The widow began to tell small stories of her past, not the deepest griefs but memories of her family, of her husband, of times when life had been brighter. The rancher listened, not interrupting, offering no false comfort, simply allowing her to speak. His presence was steady, like the walls of the ranch itself, strong and unyielding, yet silently supportive. She began to feel trust growing, a trust that had been absent for far too long. Yet despite these moments of connection, the widow could not forget the fear that had driven her to the ranch. She still remembered the moment she had begged for her life, the desperation in her voice, the vulnerability that had laid her bare. She realized that the rancher's refusal of her plea had been a form of tough kindness. He had given her life, yes, but he had not let her rely on pity or desperation. He had forced her to stand on her own, to earn her place, to regain her strength and dignity. This realization was painful, yet freeing. She understood that survival meant more than escape. It meant growth, courage, and resilience. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day the widow felt herself changing. She was no longer the fragile, desperate woman who had arrived at the ranch. She was stronger, more confident, and more aware of her own abilities. She had learned to find joy in small successes, to find hope in the routine of work, and to find comfort in the quiet presence of the rancher. He had not promised her love, nor had he made her a part of his life by obligation, but through his steady actions and quiet acknowledgement, he had given her something more valuable, a chance to live fully, to heal, and to grow. The rancher, too, could see the change. The woman who had arrived trembling and pleading was no longer defined by fear. She had claimed her place on the ranch through determination and care. He began to think differently about her, not as a burden or a responsibility, but as a person with strength, resilience, and quiet courage. He realized that life could offer unexpected gifts, even when one thought all hope was lost. The widow had reminded him of the power of persistence, the courage it took to survive, and the value of human connection, even when spoken words were few. By the end of the month, the ranch had become a place of mutual respect and understanding. The widow had found her footing, contributing meaningfully to the work of the ranch. She had regained strength, confidence, and a sense of purpose. The rancher had observed her closely, learning from her resilience, and slowly, he began to see her not just as someone in need, but as a person worthy of trust and regard. Their lives were quietly intertwined now, not by promises or desperation, but by shared effort, respect, and a mutual recognition of strength. And so, in the quiet rhythms of ranch life, something new began to grow. The widow's plea had not been answered in the way she had imagined, but it had opened a door she could never have opened herself. She had survived the night, earned her place, and begun to heal. The rancher had refused her plea, yet in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift, the chance to reclaim her life, on her own terms, with dignity and hope. The days on the ranch grew longer and steadier, and the widow began to find comfort in the rhythm of work. She had been on the ranch for weeks now, and though she still carried the weight of her past, she was learning how to live again, how to trust the steady flow of daily life. The chores, feeding the animals, mending fences, collecting water, no longer felt like burdens, but like small victories, each one a step toward reclaiming her strength and confidence. Every morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the hills, she moved through her tasks with careful attention, her hands strong and her mind alert. The rancher watched her quietly, not with expectation, but with careful observation. He noticed how she approached each task with determination, how she treated the animals with gentle care, and how she never sought praise or acknowledgement. There was something in her silence, he realized, that spoke louder than words ever could. She carried her past with dignity, never asking for sympathy, yet never hiding her pain either. It was a delicate balance, one that the rancher could not help but admire. He began to see her not as a stranger or a burden, but as a person with quiet strength, someone who had endured unimaginable hardships yet refused to let them define her entirely. Their conversations remained limited, yet each word exchanged carried meaning. They spoke of the weather, of crops, and of animals, of the chores that filled their days and kept the ranch running. She listened to his stories about the land and its demands, and he listened to her memories of her family and the small joys of her past life. These conversations were simple, yet they were threads weaving a bond between them, a connection built not on grand declarations, but on shared understanding and respect. One afternoon, as the sun reached its peak, the widow found herself repairing a broken fence near the edge of the pasture. She struggled with the stubborn nails and heavy wooden beams, her muscles straining under the effort. The rancher came to her side, not to take over, but to offer quiet guidance. "Use your weight here," he said softly, showing her how to leverage the beam without hurting herself. She followed his advice carefully, feeling the difference immediately. Together they completed the repair, side by side, without a word of complaint. In that moment, the widow felt a profound sense of accomplishment, and more importantly, a sense of belonging. She was part of something larger than herself now, contributing to the life and work of the ranch and earning the quiet respect of the man who had once refused her plea. Evenings brought a different kind of closeness. The widow would prepare the simple meals, while the rancher would sit nearby, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent. They ate together not as friends or family yet, but as two people sharing space and survival. She began to notice the small details, the way he paused before speaking, the careful attention he gave to the tasks at hand, the way he listened not just with his ears, but with his presence. And he, in turn, began to notice her patience, her thoughtfulness, and the resilience that showed in every movement she made. They were learning to understand each other without needing to explain everything, finding a rhythm in the quiet companionship that grew stronger with each day. Despite the growing familiarity, the widow's heart still carried a fragile uncertainty. She had arrived at the ranch begging for life, her plea raw and desperate. She had expected an answer of either acceptance or rejection, yet the rancher had given her something far more difficult, a chance without guarantee. She realized that survival was not about being given life. It was about reclaiming it, step by step, with courage and patience. This realization changed her perspective. She no longer saw herself as someone weak or dependent. She was a woman rebuilding her life, learning to stand on her own, while sharing her days with someone who had shown her kindness without condition. The rancher, too, experienced a quiet transformation. He had met many people over the years, but few had touched him as deeply as this widow. Her strength, resilience, and honesty were unlike anything he had encountered. He began to reflect on his own life, the choices he had made, and the walls he had built around himself. For years he had lived in solitude, careful not to let anyone close enough to hurt him. Yet here was a woman, quiet and unassuming, who had endured loss and hardship with courage and grace. She had entered his life in desperation, yet she remained steadfast and capable, proving that even in vulnerability there could be strength. As weeks turned into months, the widow grew stronger and more confident. She took pride in her work, in the animals she cared for, and in the small improvements she made around the ranch. Her presence became a steady part of the rancher's life, a quiet but undeniable force that brought warmth and life to the once lonely property. She learned to rise before dawn, to anticipate the needs of the animals, and to complete tasks with careful precision. In doing so, she rediscovered her own capabilities, and with them, a sense of self-worth she had feared lost forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft pink and orange glow across the plains, the widow and the rancher sat on the porch in silence. The air was cool, the breeze gentle, and the animals had settled for the night. For a moment the world seemed still, as if holding its breath. The widow felt a sense of peace she had not known in months, perhaps even years. She realized that while her plea had been born of desperation, the life she was living now was one she had chosen for herself. She had claimed it through her actions, her resilience, and her willingness to face each day with courage. The rancher broke the silence, his voice soft but firm. "You have worked hard," he said, "and you have earned your place here. Not because of a plea or a promise, but because of your strength." The words were simple, yet they carried immense weight. The widow felt a swell of emotion, a mixture of relief, pride, and gratitude. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt fully acknowledged, not as a desperate woman pleading for life, but as someone capable, deserving, and respected. As the days continued, small gestures of trust and care began to appear. The rancher would ask her opinion on tasks, sometimes letting her take the lead in decisions about the animals or the garden. She began to feel a sense of agency, a freedom to contribute and make choices. And she noticed the rancher's own respect for her growing, visible in the way he listened, the way he sought her input, and the quiet pride in his eyes when she accomplished a difficult task. Their relationship was evolving slowly, carefully built not on desperation or obligation, but on mutual respect and understanding. Yet despite the growing connection, both remained cautious. The widow's heart still carried the echoes of her past losses, and the rancher's heart bore the scars of solitude. Trust was not given freely. It was earned through consistent care, patience, and observation. Each day was a test of character, a proof of resilience, and a demonstration of reliability. They learned to measure their words, to act with intention, and to recognize the value of small, thoughtful gestures. It was in these quiet, seemingly ordinary moments that their bond deepened, rooted not in romance or need, but in the shared experience of life rebuilt from hardship. One morning after a night of unexpected rain, the widow found herself repairing a small section of the roof damaged by the storm. The rancher joined her, handing her tools and steadying the boards, working as a team without words. The physical labor, the rhythm of movement, and the shared effort brought them closer, fostering a connection that neither could force but that naturally grew. In these moments she felt trust and understanding flowing between them, unspoken but undeniable. She realized that life, even after immense loss, could offer companionship, safety, and hope without requiring desperation or pleas. By the time the season began to shift towards spring, the widow had found her place on the ranch. She was no longer defined by the desperate plea that had brought her here. She was a part of the daily life, a presence that brought care, diligence, and warmth. The rancher had seen her strength and resilience, and in turn she had seen his fairness and steady nature. Together they had built a quiet partnership rooted in respect, understanding, and shared purpose. It was a slow, careful bond, one that neither had expected but both had come to value deeply. And so, life on the ranch continued, steady and strong. The widow's journey of survival had evolved into a journey of growth and trust. She had arrived pleading for life, but she was now living it fully, not because it had been given to her, but because she had earned it through courage, diligence, and patience. The rancher had refused her initial plea, yet through that refusal, he had given her something far more valuable: the chance to reclaim her strength, to find trust, and to build a life with meaning once again. In the quiet moments between work and rest, as the sun painted the plains with shades of gold and amber, both the widow and the rancher understood that something new had taken root. It was not love as the world defines it, nor friendship in its simplest form. It was something deeper, the recognition of strength, resilience, and humanity in each other. It was a bond forged not by need or desperation, but by shared effort, understanding, and the slow, steady growth of trust. And it was in this bond that both found a measure of peace, hope, and the quiet promise of a life rebuilt together. Spring had begun to paint the ranch with new life. The animals moved more freely in the warming sun. The fields were turning green, and the air smelled of fresh earth and blooming flowers. The widow had grown stronger over the months, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that had been absent when she first arrived. She had learned the rhythm of the ranch, earned the respect of the rancher, and reclaimed a sense of purpose that had seemed impossible in the days when survival had been her only goal. Yet, even as life seemed to settle into a peaceful routine, she felt a stirring in her heart, a quiet need to prove to herself that she could stand on her own, without depending on anyone's mercy or protection. She began to think more about her future, about the life she wanted to build, and about the possibility of leaving the ranch to test her independence. Though the rancher had treated her with kindness and respect, she did not want to remain out of obligation or pity. She wanted her life to be her own, chosen freely, not borrowed from someone else's generosity. Each day she spent on the ranch, she honed her skills and regained her confidence, realizing that she could survive and thrive if she continued to trust herself. Her desire for independence grew stronger with every task she completed, every animal she tended, and every responsibility she handled successfully. One morning, as she was feeding the animals, she noticed the rancher watching her from a distance. His expression was calm, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. She approached him, unsure of how to explain the thoughts swirling in her mind. "I am grateful for everything you have done," she began carefully, "but I think I need to leave soon. I need to see if I can make my own way, without relying on anyone else."
Her voice was steady, yet it carried the weight of emotion she could not fully hide. She feared his reaction, worried that he might see her desire for independence as ingratitude or rejection.
The rancher listened without interrupting, his gaze steady and thoughtful. He had grown accustomed to her presence, her diligence, and her quiet courage, and he had come to respect the strength that had carried her through unimaginable hardships. Yet he also understood her need to prove herself, to test the limits of her own resilience. After a moment of silence, he spoke in his calm, measured tone. "You have come far," he said. "You have worked hard, learned quickly, and shown strength beyond what many could manage. If leaving is what you need to do, then you should do it. But know this, your place here will not disappear because you leave. You are capable of more than you realize." The widow felt a surge of gratitude and relief at his words. He did not try to persuade her to stay, nor did he offer empty reassurances. He acknowledged her strength and gave her the freedom to choose her path. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt the full weight of her own power. The power to decide, to act, and to claim her life without fear or expectation. She realized that the rancher had not only given her safety, but also the courage to trust herself, the confidence to believe in her own abilities, and the understanding that life could be chosen, not begged for.
In the days that followed, she prepared herself for the possibility of leaving.
She organized her belongings, tended to the animals with extra care, and practiced the skills she might need if she ventured into the wider world. The rancher, in turn, continued his quiet observation, noting her determination and offering guidance only when asked. Their interactions were still marked by respect and patience, but now there was a subtle shift, an acknowledgement that she was no longer a fragile guest dependent on his kindness, but a capable individual testing her own limits. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the sky was painted with shades of gold and pink, the widow approached the rancher once more. Her voice was steady, but her heart raced with a mix of fear and excitement. "I think I am ready to leave," she said softly. "I need to see if I can make it on my own. I hope you understand." The rancher studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, slowly, with a quiet pride.
"I understand," he said. "You have earned this chance."
"You are ready, and I believe in you. Remember, strength comes not only from endurance, but from the courage to face the unknown." The widow felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had arrived at the ranch pleading for life, desperate and fearful, and now she was preparing to leave as a strong, capable woman ready to face the world on her own terms. The journey she had taken over the past months had transformed her, teaching her resilience, patience, and the value of steady work and quiet trust. She realized that the rancher's refusal of her initial plea had been the turning point that allowed her to grow. By not giving her life freely, he had forced her to reclaim it herself, and in doing so she had discovered her own strength. As the day of her planned departure approached, the widow and the rancher spent more time together, completing final tasks and preparing the ranch for her absence. They repaired fences, tended the garden, and cared for the animals together, their movements synchronized through months of shared work. In these quiet moments, the widow realized that her connection with the rancher had deepened beyond gratitude or respect. She felt a bond built on trust, understanding, and the shared experience of survival and growth. Yet she also knew that leaving would be a test of her independence, a final step in proving to herself that she could live fully without relying on anyone else's mercy. The night before her departure, they sat together on the porch, the air filled with the scents of the earth and the quiet sounds of the ranch settling into rest. The widow felt a mixture of fear, excitement, and sadness. She had grown to rely on the steady presence of the rancher, and leaving would be a challenge both practical and emotional. Yet she knew that this was necessary. She had come to the ranch pleading for life, and now she was leaving to claim it fully, to prove that she could live with dignity and purpose on her own terms. The rancher spoke quietly, his words steady and thoughtful. "Life is never without challenges," he said, "but you have faced more than most. You have grown stronger here, and now it is time to test that strength. Go with courage, and remember that your choices are yours alone." His voice carried no warning, no pressure, only faith in her ability to succeed. The widow felt her heart swell with gratitude and determination. She knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but she also knew that she was ready. The next morning, as the sun rose over the hills, the widow gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. The rancher walked with her to the edge of the property, helping her secure her supplies and ensuring she had everything she might need. The animals she had cared for nuzzled her gently, as if sensing the significance of the moment. She looked back at the ranch, at the place that had been both refuge and teacher, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. This land and its caretaker had given her more than life. They had given her confidence, skill, and the understanding that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. Before leaving, she turned to the rancher, her eyes reflecting both strength and emotion. "Thank you," she said softly. Not just for keeping me alive, but for helping me find my strength." The rancher nodded, his expression calm but full of quiet pride. "You have earned everything you have," he replied. "Go and live the life you are capable of living. Nothing can take that from you." With one last look at the ranch, the widow stepped forward, her heart filled with hope and courage. She had arrived pleading for life, but she was leaving ready to claim it fully, to build her own future, and to test the limits of her strength. The rancher watched her go, feeling a deep respect for the woman who had faced the unknown and emerged stronger. He had not given her life freely, but in refusing to do so, he had allowed her to discover the strength and resilience that had been inside her all along. As she walked toward the horizon, the widow felt the wind on her face and the sun on her back. She knew that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but she also knew that she was ready. She carried with her the lessons of the ranch, the quiet bond with the man who had shown her both kindness and discipline, and the knowledge that life was something to be claimed, not begged for. And in that moment she understood the true meaning of courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it, armed with strength, determination, and the confidence that she could endure whatever lay ahead. The sun rose gently over the ranch, spilling light across the fields and glinting on the fences the widow had helped repair. The air was crisp and alive with the sounds of animals beginning their day. It was a morning like many others, but for both the widow and the rancher it carried a quiet weight, a sense that life, which had shifted slowly over the past months, was moving towards something new. They had shared the labor, the routines, and the silent understanding that comes from surviving hardship together. Yet a change was approaching, subtle but undeniable, as both of them began to recognize the depth of the bond that had grown between them. The widow had returned to the ranch after a brief journey to test her independence, carrying with her the lessons she had learned on the open plains. She had proven to herself that she could survive, navigate challenges, and rely on her own strength. Yet, as she approached the familiar fences and the warm buildings of the ranch, she realized that something within her had shifted. Survival was no longer her only goal. She wanted connection, purpose, and the quiet comfort of being seen and valued for who she was, not just what she could endure. The rancher noticed her return with a mix of relief and quiet admiration. He had watched her leave, knowing it was necessary for her growth, and he had respected her courage. But seeing her return now, standing tall and confident, filled him with a sense of pride and recognition. She was no longer the desperate woman who had arrived months ago. She was whole again, strong, capable, and self-assured. Yet in her eyes, he saw the same trust and acknowledgement that had formed between them over time, a bond that neither had forced but that had naturally grown through shared work, respect, and understanding. They began to talk, slowly at first, about her journey away from the ranch. She shared stories of the challenges she had faced, the small victories she had achieved, and the lessons she had learned about resilience, courage, and self-reliance. The rancher listened quietly, nodding and understanding, offering advice only when she asked. Their conversation was gentle, filled with mutual respect, and marked by the knowledge that they had both changed through their experiences. It was in these shared words that the depth of their connection became clear. A partnership not born of necessity, but of choice and recognition of each other's worth. Over the next few days, they settled back into the routines of ranch life, yet something had shifted subtly in the way they interacted. There was more warmth, more openness, and an unspoken understanding that they had grown together, not just as caretaker and guest, but as equals. The widow contributed fully, taking the lead on tasks she had mastered, caring for the animals, and tending to the garden. The rancher trusted her judgment, listened to her insights, and valued her presence in a way he had never expressed before. They were no longer teacher and learner, or rescuer and rescued. They were partners in life, sharing the responsibilities, challenges, and small joys of the ranch. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing a broken section of fence, the widow paused to look at the rancher. She saw in his eyes not only the respect and admiration he had always shown, but also a quiet vulnerability, a recognition that life had given them both an unexpected gift. She realized that her journey of survival, growth, and self-discovery had brought them to this point, a place where mutual respect and understanding could blossom into something deeper. Her heart, once heavy with grief and fear, now carried hope and the possibility of love, built on trust, patience, and shared experience. The rancher, for his part, began to recognize the feelings that had grown quietly over time. He had admired her strength from the beginning, respected her resilience, and appreciated her diligence. But now he felt something more profound, a desire for partnership, not out of obligation or pity, but from genuine regard for the person she had become. He realized that he could no longer imagine the ranch without her presence, without her quiet wisdom, her steadfast courage, and the warmth she brought to his life. Their bond had grown naturally through months of shared labor, challenges, and trust, and it was now clear that it was a connection neither could ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills and the sky glowed with shades of gold and pink, the widow and the rancher sat together on the porch. The air was calm, filled with the scents of the earth and the soft sounds of the animals settling for the night. The widow turned to him, her voice gentle but steady. "I have learned so much here," she said. "I have learned to trust myself, to face challenges, and to live with courage. But I have also realized that some things are better faced together. You have given me more than safety. You have given me hope, and the chance to believe in life again." The rancher listened, his expression calm but deeply thoughtful. He reached out, placing a steady hand on hers, a gesture of trust, care, and acknowledgement. "You have changed my life as well," he said softly. "You have shown me strength, patience, and courage that I had long forgotten existed. You have taught me that life can be rebuilt and that connection can grow in the quietest of ways. I would be honored if you chose to stay, not because you need to, but because you want to, and because we have built something together that is stronger than either of us alone." Tears welled in the widow's eyes, not from fear or sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she had found more than survival. She had found a home, a partnership, and a life she could embrace fully. The months of struggle, growth, and quiet labor had brought them to this point. A choice freely made, not forced by desperation or circumstance. She knew that her past would always be a part of her, but she also knew that the future could be filled with hope, trust, and love, nurtured through respect and shared experience. Over the following weeks, they began to build a new life together. The widow no longer relied solely on her own strength. She shared responsibilities, decisions, and moments of joy with the rancher. They worked side by side, repaired fences, tended to the animals, and cared for the land, each day strengthening not only the ranch but also the quiet bond that had grown between them. They shared laughter, stories, and moments of quiet reflection, learning to balance independence with connection, self-reliance with partnership. The animals responded to the harmony between them, moving with calm and trust, as if sensing the renewed energy and balance on the ranch. The garden flourished, the fences stood strong, and the home became a place of warmth and stability. The widow felt a sense of peace she had never known before, a life not defined by desperation or survival, but by choice, courage, and the quiet joy of shared purpose. The rancher, too, found a sense of fulfillment, realizing that the bond they had built was a partnership of equals, grounded in respect, understanding, and mutual care. As seasons changed, the widow and rancher grew closer, not through grand gestures or hurried promises, but through the steady, consistent presence they provided each other. They shared the work, the challenges, and the small triumphs of everyday life. They celebrated the successes of the land, the animals, and the home they had nurtured together. And in these moments, They discovered the quiet, enduring power of a bond built on choice, trust, and shared experience, stronger than fear, deeper than obligation, and more meaningful than any desperate plea for survival. Years later, the widow would reflect on her journey with gratitude. She remembered the day she had arrived at the ranch pleading for life, and the way the rancher had refused her initial plea while still offering her safety and care. That refusal had forced her to find her own strength, to reclaim her life, and to grow into the woman she had become. It was a lesson she would carry forever, that true survival is not simply enduring hardships, but discovering the courage to live fully, make choices freely, and build a life with purpose and dignity. The rancher, too, would remember her arrival as a turning point, not just for her, but for him. As we observed this town speaking, he had learned that kindness and discipline, patience and respect could foster growth and connection in ways that neither could have anticipated. By refusing her plea for immediate rescue, he had allowed her to find her own strength, and in doing so had discovered the depth of her courage, resilience, and humanity. Their lives had intertwined in a way that brought healing, joy, and a shared sense of purpose neither had expected. And so the ranch became more than a place of survival. It became a home, a sanctuary, and a symbol of hope. The widow had not only survived, but she had thrived. She had learned to trust herself, to embrace life fully, and to build a partnership based on respect, understanding, and shared growth. The rancher had not only offered safety, but he had witnessed her transformation, and together they had created a life of meaning, purpose, and quiet happiness. The widow had arrived with a desperate plea: "Take me as your wife, or let me die." The rancher had refused the plea, yet in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift of all, the chance to reclaim her life, find her strength, and choose her own path. And in the end, she did not stay out of obligation or fear. She stayed because she chose to, because she had found connection, purpose, and hope on the ranch. And in that choice, both the widow and the rancher discovered the quiet, enduring power of human courage, trust, and love. Life on the ranch continued, steady and strong. The widow and the rancher worked side by side, faced challenges together, and shared moments of joy, each day deepening the bond they had forged. The land thrived under their care. The animals flourished, and the home became a place of warmth and life. And for the widow, who had once arrived on the brink of despair, the ranch became a symbol of survival, growth, and the transformative power of trust and choice.